Hey there everybody, this is the Vintage Sewing Machine Garage. I'm making a video today that I spoke about, sort of mentioning to you all about the coming videos in the future, and this is one of them. One of the things I've gotten a lot of questions about from people is, do you repaint sewing machines? And of course the answer that I've always given is no. I do not strip machines and I don't repaint them. There are people who do this. The time and effort that is required to do that properly is extraordinary, and the cost is extraordinary. Now, there are people who've had it done, and these folks enjoy repainted machines in some ways, in a similar vein that people enjoy customized cars and hot rods. But for my purposes, as all of you know, I work to go through and do full overhauls of machines and to stabilize them, right? To conserve what is there and to make sure that they function once again. And when it comes to the aesthetics of a machine, I normally will use, as I've used on the majority of this little Necchi here, I clean, the dust off, and then I go back with sewing machine oil. And it is amazing the kind of shine that I get. Now, I'm not done with completely cleaning and rubbing oil into this paint finish, which is remarkably in good shape. Some of the Neckis do suffer from paint issues. Not all of them, but you will sometimes see this on Neckis more often than you will a Singer, for example. It's not a lack of quality in terms of how the machines were made. I suspect it may have had something to do with the chemistry of the paint they used or the conditions of the paint room at the time. Who knows? In any case, I wanted to make a video though today to show you guys one of the very rare times when I actually do any painting on a machine. Most often it's a black machine. Now, I have a couple of sort of things to mention first. I have taken, in this case, an old t-shirt and here another piece of cotton fabric, and I'm basically putting this down as a sort of a protectant to the area around my machine. I've got some very nice black lacquer here, and I don't want alcohol or anything else touching it in this process. You just take the extra time to do this, because the first time you ever harm the finish on one of your machines because you got a little droplet of, this is the 91% rubbing alcohol. It's very powerful. It works great as a cleaner, as you're going to see, but it can also really mar and damage the paint finishes on your machines, and it will do it virtually instantly. It's not like you have a few minutes. There is no wiggle room with that. So I've got my, no surprise here, I've got cotton swabs today. I've got my alcohol. I have paintbrushes. Now, paintbrushes for the purpose of what we're going to do today, I got these at a craft store. And, Michael's is one chain. There are many different chains depending on what region, whether you're in the US or Canada, whatever part of North America you're in, you will find usually some place where you can buy craft supplies. Now, they sell fine artist brushes, which can be quite expensive, and any of you who are engaged in fine arts know that there is a reason why you want to spend a lot of money on brushes. This is not one of them. Now, this is also not the cheapest little brush you would find, in a dollar store either, because the cheapest brushes will shed and come apart, and they will create unhappiness for you in this project. This is kind of a middle of the road. I think I may have given, I don't know, $7 or $8, and I got 25 of these brushes, and it's a variety pack. They come in different sizes and widths, so take your pick. Most of them are synthetic brushes, and I think for our purposes they will function just fine. But today I want to talk a little bit about what I use, and you're going to see me do some of the painting and how I approach it. Almost every one of you, all of us have painted something in our lives at some point. Many of you may have painted a room in your house, or you've painted different things. Painting actually doesn't take that much time to apply the actual paint. But like many things, preparation is everything. Your effort, if you're going to do this, is to do it properly. It doesn't take a lot of time necessarily, but you really want to consider taking the extra steps, and some of these I'm going to show you today. The first thing I'm going to do, this is not really one of the painting steps, is I'm going to take the hand wheel, this is the little clutch knob on my Necchi. I'm going to take off the little knob, and of course behind here you will see something that should really be in a troubleshooting video. Let's see if this is going to show up for you guys. There's a piece of thread. Very often when people use the bobbin winder, they get, let's see if it'll show up against the backdrop of that lighter fabric. Not sure if this is going to show up at all, but there's a very small, there it is, you can see it against my thumb. There's a very thin piece of thread that got coiled around the clutch knob, and that's one thing that can interfere with your machine's performance. And of course she has her clutch knob washer, which we want to retain. And then I'm just going to wiggle off. Here is the actual hand wheel. Came off. Necchis don't always come off this easily. And surprisingly, there's no paint loss here, which is great. You will sometimes see it on this edge as well. This Necchi is actually in a lot better shape than some of them are sometimes. And of course I've got my belt. My belt here is a rubber belt, still in good shape. It's not that old, even though it's a little dusty. So I wanted to remove this. I'm going to turn the camera just a bit, and we'll get it to, see if we can get it to focus in for you guys. And of course, this is what you're going to see. Now, this machine was interesting. When I saw it, there was some paint loss here, and there was paint that was loose. And so I don't sand this, and I don't, I want to be gentle with the metal. I don't want to, put gouges in it. Excuse me. So what I did was I took my my cotton swabs and I basically went over the area. And what I'm trying to do is to pull any paint that is loose, okay, that has loosened over time. And you can see me just rubbing, and I'm not scraping with anything hard. You're not scraping the side of a barn here. And this would have been some form of lacquer paint. You can see some of this coming off. And I'm just simply going to kind of go over it, make sure that there's anything loose. Now, if any of you have ever painted houses, many of you have, you know that there's lots of instructions on those paint cans, and they always tell you, make sure the surface is clean. Make sure you have removed all loose paint. And I know that this is like one of the least exciting things you'll ever do in your life is read the label of a paint can. Oh my God. Well, there's a reason that all of that information exists, because paint likes clean surfaces to bond to. And it also likes surfaces when you're painting over old paint that is stable. If the paint is loose or unstable, that new paint is not going to stick, right? It's all about sticking, because paint is, in some ways, it's kind of like glue in a sense, because it has to stick to the surface before it cures and dries. Now, before we go any further, I want to talk a little bit about the products. I mentioned to you guys before, in one of my videos, about the paints that I use. So, this is a product called Testors. It's the brand. Testors makes paints largely for hobbyists, people who, they've been in business for a very long time, and they put paints in jars. They have two lines. They have a traditional line, which is a solvent-based paint. I don't know if it's technically a lacquer, but it's the closest thing I can find to the lacquer paints that would have been used on these vintage machines. They also carry a line of acrylics. And while those acrylic paints may be fine for the projects they were intended to be used on, I don't use them on machines. Acrylic paints are not as durable on metal, and I don't know how well they're going to adhere. They might work great, but I prefer to use something that is tried and true. Testors, this particular product, paint that they offer, comes in these tiny little jars, and you can see how small they are. I mean, the jar is just a little taller than the clutch knob here. They're little tiny jars, but that's really all you're going to need. In fact, this is probably going to be more paint than I normally ever use. Sometimes I'll do a little touch-up. I typically don't touch everything up on the machine, but I was getting some chunks of paint were coming off of here, and I thought this would be one of those times when I actually do some paint. Now, the Testor paints that you go to purchase, they will have a color name in front of them, but you got to check the labels. Now, the labels on these are, no surprise, very small, and they're very hard to read. Now, here I'm trying to zoom in with the camera, and I'll see if it'll focus for you guys. I don't know if you can see that. That is FL black, and it stands for flat black. I took a Sharpie and put this on the lid and on the side because I knew I don't want to mix the two up. And the reason for this is I'm going to use the flat black as my first coat. And I'm simply doing that because it's not technically a primer, but it's going to function like one. And I won't go into the details of why you prime, but it's nice to have the flat painted finish first, because when I go to do my second coat, it's easier to see when I put the second coat on, which of course will be gloss black to match the original on the machine. But that way I can make sure that I get two coats everywhere. And it's easier to see when your first coat is flat going back over with a gloss. Maybe that'll make more sense to you all when I actually go to do it and show it to you. In any case, this is the product I'm going to use. I've got my brushes, I've got my paints. Again, this product is solvent-based, so you're going to want to ventilate the area very well. In this day and time, not everyone uses solvent-based paints much anymore, so I always want to remind people, make sure you have fantastic ventilation, and also you can also they make breathing masks that help filter out fumes. So always remember to do that, even with a small jar like this. Okay, let's see. I'm going to move the camera one more time. And I'm repositioning the camera so you can see me on this side. This side particularly, again, the paint was loose. And I'm just taking this. I know a cotton swab doesn't seem like much of a paint scraper. But again, if I'm pushing with this cotton swab, anything that's loose is very likely to pop off, right? And I want old paint that's loose. I don't want to leave it on there, because if I do, I'm going to have new paint not stick, and it's going to come off, and then you think, why did I bother to do all of this if it's not going to stay? So we want to do this the proper way. Whoops. I don't want to get any of my cotton swabs stuck in there. So make sure that's not in there. Now, this piece, this is of course, this is my bobbin winder, and this pushes down when I move the lever here, and then when I pull up, it pulls the bobbin tire off of the hand wheel when you're using it for winding bobbins. So, what I'm showing all of you here could apply to your own painting project. You may have a different color. Now keep in mind, Testors of course comes in different colors. However, if it's very unlikely you're going to find a perfect match for if you have a machine color. And in that case, if you want to buy different colors of the Testors and try to mix them and custom match, you can do that. Honestly, I find that that's usually not worthwhile, at least in my own experience. And so what I typically do is I try to focus, typically black. Black is the most common color in vintage machines until you get into the 1950s. And I have found that paint finishes from machines in the 50s and 60s was chemically somewhat different. It may have been a lacquer base, but it typically was not always clear coated, and they can have paint issues, but it's not as common. It's when you go back to before the 50s with a lot of your black machines which had their decals applied. Let's see if I can highlight the little Necchi decal here. They had their decals applied after the black paint was put on, and then over the decals was, of course, a clear coat of lacquer. And that is the most common thing that you're going to find. Okay, so focusing back on this area. Next thing I want to do, and this is something, guys, you want to do very carefully. Do not be in a hurry, okay? Now, I could tape off this area with painter's tape, which would not stick too badly. But if I take my cotton swab, I'm going to dip it down in the alcohol, but then I'm going to kind of make sure that it's not dripping, okay? You don't want it just like dripping wet here. You don't need a ton of alcohol with this stuff. Now, what I'm going to do, I just bumped into my camera there, not the first time. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to take that alcohol on the cotton swab, and I'm going to go over this, basically the area where the paint has come off, okay? I don't know what's there. It could be no residue. It could be very likely sewing machine oil or grease residue. And if any of you have ever learned the hard way with any of your house painting, if you ever try to, let's say you were painting a kitchen wall and you didn't clean that wall and you had grease on it, you're going to have problems with that paint sticking. And that's true no matter what kind of paint you're using. And here I'm basically going along the edge of this side, just along the edge to make sure, because any place that I'm going to put new paint needs to be clean. And by clean, I mean clean of grease and dirt. I'm not going to use water here. There are places where you can use a damp rag cleaning a machine, but I don't want it here on this metal. I don't want any moisture at all when I'm getting ready to paint. Okay, so again, any of these areas that are bare metal, I'm taking the alcohol. Now I'm not going to do the alcohol on this section. I'll show you in a minute where I will apply a little bit of moisture or cleaner. So again, I'm coming over, making sure I'm getting any place that might have grease or oil, because that's going to really mess with my paint job. You may not notice it right away, but you will when the paint's trying to cure and dry. Okay, I'm going to come over here, having to sort of poke my head around the camera so you guys can see and I can see what I'm doing. And again, the alcohol is pretty strong. If you have a lot of grease and oil and you can see it or feel it, you may want to go over this more than once. You have to use your own judgment in that case, really. So now I've gotten. Now the alcohol is. You can see it's starting to pull some of the color of the paint where if I've overlapped from the bare metal area to the paint. So again, you want to be cautious with that. If you're going to be painting over that painted area that's remnant there, that's probably okay to do that just gently, right? Now, I can also take a cotton swab and I can put it, basically I can just wet this. And you can wet the cotton swab in a little bit of water, but again, you're never pouring anything on here, okay? So I'm going to do that. So I've got a little moisture here on the end of the cotton swab, and then I'm going to just come over that paint that's still there, that's not coming off, so that if I end up painting over that, I want to make sure there's no grease on there, and you can see if you guys can see what's on the cotton swab here. Not sure if that's picking up or not. There's some stuff coming off here, and again, you'll see it on the swab. In this case, it's not a ton, but you never know, right? And if you had old oil and grease, there's some. If you have old oil and grease on something that's black, you may not even be able to see it. Right, easily. It's different if you have a light colored machine, one of those that was done in like a cream color decades later. But here, I've got some grease and oil that maybe somebody had on the bobbin winding mechanism, and it got onto the paint down here. Just like I say, just assume, being a sewing machine, it's got grease and oil around here, and you want to make sure any place you're going to put paint, you have kind of addressed this issue to make sure that you got a clean surface. So, sometimes, particularly in paint projects in the house, people often get excited. Oh, we're going to paint. It's going to be awesome. And it may be awesome, but they often, I'll go back over with alcohol one more time, they get in a hurry and they don't always read the labels. They don't pay attention to what the instructions are. And they think, well, heck, come on, I've painted before. It was no big deal. I don't need to read instructions. Well, a lot of us, even if we painted, it might be years in between. And it's not like we keep the details of painting specs in our head. So it's always a good idea to revisit the instructions, as silly as that sounds. Okay, guys, I've got the jar of flat black enamel, and This is a jar I had from before, and I'm just giving a little stir. Remember that, like all paints, these paints also will settle over time, and you need to kind of make sure that they're stirred properly, just like you would house paint that had been sitting for a while before you use it. Now, one of the things to mention to you guys is the way these paints work is they perform better when you use multiple coats, as opposed to trying to just slob on one big thick coat. And this has always been true of the old oil house paints. You get better results, and you're less apt to have problems. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get an initial coat put on. I've got two different size brushes I'm going to try. Again, these brushes are not super expensive. This is not a fine art brush. Of course, you're going to want to make sure you don't have the brush too big. As silly as it sounds, if you try to get a brush, you can't use a brush that's larger than the jar unless you have some other method for getting to the paint. I should have enough in here to do this project. So my first little task here is to go ahead and get my first coat on. Now, black has a lot more pigment than some of the colors, and it typically will cover better than you might think, considering it's a solvent, or what many of us might call an oil-based paint. But it's a paint that does not use water, but rather solvent. And I'm just going to come in here, and again, I'm putting on this initial coat. We'll see, I may, if I'm going to coat this whole piece here, I may not need that small brush, but I have it as an option. And again, I'm actually not trying to necessarily repaint the whole thing. I don't really have to, but I want to make sure I get the flat version of this enamel onto any bare metal areas, okay? Because I want at least 2 coats. 3 would be nice, but 2 may be okay. We'll see how it turns out. Again, other colors can sometimes require more because they don't cover as well. They're more translucent. So I'm going to come over here. I changed the angle for you guys so maybe you could get kind of an aerial view of what I'm doing. Typically, when you're using paints like this, or maybe any paints, you want to pull from the wet area into the dry. And you don't want to overly brush. And keep in mind, because this paint has solvent, it dries faster, or begins to dry faster, than many water-based paints do. And it's been many years since a lot of us used oil-based paints for our homes, and so you might want to get reacquainted. The behavior of these paints is not unlike that of nail polish that people use to paint nails with. It's not the same, but they are closer in the way they behave than than comparing them to, say, water-based products, which so many of us are used to using these days, in things like house paint, or acrylics as they are called. Now, I may need this smaller brush. I don't want to get paint on my chrome pieces. If I do, I can get it off. It's not going to be a tragedy, but I got this little spot here. I'm going to go ahead and take my smaller brush, and I don't want to interfere with this little pin area, because remember, this pin needs to move. So I want to make sure, and if I got any oil on it, it would show up. I did not. But again, it seems to be working just fine. I'm going to push in here. I want to make sure that there's no paint film that has, developed on that little gap area, because that will put stress on the paint finish. Now, you can already see some of these areas already starting to dry. And because this is the flat paint, what will happen is, as it begins to dry, the glossiness, it will be less wet and it will start to look flat. And that'll make a much easier surface for when it's time to go and put the second coat, which will be the gloss, the gloss black. Now, one thing I want to mention to you guys that's really important, because of the way these paints dry, you have when I go to do my next coat, I basically have 2 windows, and only 2 windows to do this. This paint, on a day like today, we have a really, it's a beautiful sunny day out. We had gotten some rain a few days ago, and I was waiting for a day like today because the level of humidity has lifted, okay? There's still some humidity in the air, obviously, but it's not nearly as muggy and humid as it was a few days ago. Paints dry based on the humidity levels in the air. And that is in the small print on all of your house paints and even on paints like this, even though I don't think they got it on that tiny little label. So if it was raining outside and you were painting, that can really throw off the drying times of your paint. But that's important, not just because, well, you think, oh, so what? It'll take longer to dry, no big deal. This is something you want to pay attention to. This paint, on a day like today with fairly low relative humidity, it's a nice sunny day, it's going to take relatively 1 to 2 hours for this paint to cure enough that it can have its second coat put on. So in a few hours I'm going to come back and I should be able to apply the gloss black, and it will bond just fine to the paint and we should have a great finish. Now let's say this dries and let's say you're doing this, you're using this product, and then something happens or you get a call and you have to step away. If you don't come back and do that second coat within a couple of hours, what's going to happen is the paint is going to continue to cure, and as more of the solvents evaporate out, okay, even though it's dry to the touch, it's still soft, it's curing, it's going through a process where oxygen eventually allows it to dry into a hard paint finish. If you are too late in coming back to it, then that second coat is going to need to wait for 48 hours, okay? So there's a window of working time, as artists often use that term. So after a few hours, this has dried enough, okay? You can't come back in 20 minutes, you'll mess up the paint finish. But if it has had about anywhere from 1 to 2 hours, and you can experiment to see how long is enough, you should be able to go back with your second coat. If you wait more than that, if it's 4 hours and 5 hours and so forth, or even 3 hours, you run a risk, because if you come back with that second coat, when this first coat is past its little window after a few hours, what's going to happen is all the solvent in the second coat will dissolve this and can create bubbling and can create a huge mess. It's called lifting, where that first coat starts to lift up because it's been destabilized, okay? There's a chemical reaction going on with paint. Paints are a lot more complex than we give them credit for. A lot of us think paint is not a high-tech thing, but it sure is, and you'll know it if you get it wrong. So, I'm noting what time it is, and basically what's going to happen is I'm going to give this probably in 1.5 hours today, and then I'm going to come back and I'm going to go back with a coat of gloss black. And because it's black, I anticipate that may be all I need here is 1 coat of the flat and 1 coat of the gloss. If for some reason, and this can happen, something happens and you can't come back in exactly that time, or you just forget or you get distracted, it happens. If that happens, don't worry, you can still do your second coat, but now you need to wait 2 days, okay? If it starts to rain or the humidity levels change, you are going to need to allow extra time. And that's just the way it is. That's how they work. But these paints are very strong and very durable when you use them. Again, this is, Testors has a couple of lines. They have their classic line called Testors, and they have another one called Model Masters. And a lot of people who do modeling use these paints. Some of you may have, depending on what generation you are, you may have done some model painting back in the day, and this may be a familiar brand to you. But this is what I prefer when, on the rare occasion, I don't think I've even ever made a video on painting a machine, because I had enough paint loss on this part. I thought, okay, and it's not right in the middle here where it might show. The rest of the paint on this machine is gorgeous. Why this section here, the paint had come loose, I don't know. It's hard to know. In any case, this is a great product. It has very good bonding power, and so we're just going to let this dry. And I told you guys that that you might sometimes find my videos like watching paint dry. Literally, you are watching paint dry, but I'm not going to have you sit here in front of the video waiting for the paint to dry. We're going to come back to it. And oh, by the other way, you just saw me doing this. This is a paint that once it begins to cure, okay, you're painting with it. You know, after a few minutes, do what you're going to do and leave it alone. Don't be fussy and don't keep messing with it, because you will start to disturb, again, that chemical process that's going on with the curing. And if you do that, you're going to create problems. You're going to have brush marks, and worse, you're going to have potential lifting and bubbling, okay? So one of the great things about using a paint with a lot of solvent in it is that it has what's called leveling properties that are really nice. And right now, I don't see much of it. I know this is a flat finish paint, but I'm hoping that even with the gloss finish, I don't expect to see too much in the way of paint brush marks when it dries, because that solvent gives it time to kind of smooth itself out. I know that sounds odd, but the paint will do that. Unlike the acrylic paints that many of us use in our homes today, those paints, if you're not careful, you can get lots of brush marks because they dry different, right? They dry, they just have a different curing process than these old school solvent-based or oil-based paints, as we like to call them. So there you go, guys. That's the first coat. No mess, no fuss. It wasn't hard. In fact, I spent more time talking to you guys about it than I actually took to put the paint on. And of course, take the time to get your little project area set up. You cover it with you protect the machine. You don't want to drop paint or solvent on the machine. And then, of course, you saw me take extra care to clean that surface to make sure there was no oil and grease. Get as much of that as you can off with alcohol, but again, on a cotton swab. We don't want to get alcohol anywhere else, and we have not. And now we just need a couple of hours or less, 1.5 to 2 hours tops. Again, on a beautiful, relatively dry day today. You know, it's late spring, early summer, and we will see what she looks like when we come back. So stay tuned, guys. I'll break this into 2 videos so you don't have to watch paint dry, literally. But anyway, this is a video many people have asked me about. They've asked about paint, and this is an example, one of those rare moments when I wanted to do paint as part of a restoration technique. Stay tuned for part 2.